Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Joanna, and I'm the Senior Policy Analyst for the Higher Education team at the Bipartisan Policy Center. We're going to kick things right off, and folks can join us online as we continue. First, I just want to acknowledge that we're all dealing with a lot of change and uncertainty, so being here with us today is really appreciated. BPC and New America launched this webinar recognizing the need for policymaking across the aisle in these urgent times. Big thank you to BPC's Mariette Aborn, who's been working behind the scenes, quite literally. She's running the show for you right now without being seen or heard, and she's been working diligently to make sure we could all gather together digitally. But with no further ado, I will hand the mic over to my co-host, Claire McCann at New America.
Thank you, Janan, and thanks so much to everyone who joined today. I think it's a testament to the urgency of right now that so many people took time out of their days to join us. We hope to take today's opportunity to bring the higher education policy community together and explore ways that we can effectively address many of the large-scale issues that are facing colleges and universities as they're combating COVID-19. We know there is no silver bullet solution, and actually we'll need all the silver bullets we can find to manage the current crisis. But we've asked today's guests to each present one big idea with a 5-minute time limit, which, as a warning to the presenters, we will be strictly enforcing to keep things on schedule and make sure we have time for questions.
Good afternoon. I'm really excited to kick off this conversation, and I look forward to hearing the other policy ideas that will come forward. As you all know, education is supposed to be the great equalizer. It is supposed to open doors of opportunity for all, and it is supposed to add value. And while there is tremendous value in attaining a college degree or a credential, that value is not often equitably distributed. And for some students, especially those who don't complete college, the impact of that may be most detrimental. And these are the students that I want to focus on this afternoon, those students who have not yet completed college. Some people may call them dropouts, but at IHEP, we call them stopouts. And we are working with institutional leaders nationwide on an effort called Degrees When Due, so that we can identify ways to re-engage them. African Americans and Latinx students are overrepresented within this population. Low income and moderate income students are overrepresented in this population. And so are adults who are often juggling the responsibilities of school, family, and work, and so many other commitments simultaneously. Nationwide, there are 36 million Americans who have stopped out of college. And in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, we should anticipate that this number is likely going to increase. And at the same time that number is increasing, the number of Americans who are unemployed has already increased past the 10 million mark. And the convergence of these two scenarios has resulted in a storm that is decimating our economy and workforce. You all know that. But the current crisis, I really do believe, presents an opportunity for the post-secondary sector to rise to the occasion once again and to create opportunity for students and to add value. And given all of this, I am now worried that we may see substantial state funding cuts due to budgetary pressures and prioritization of expenses other than education. And such cuts will certainly deepen the inequities that were evident before the pandemic and truly hurt our colleges and universities, especially those that are serving high proportions of low and moderate income students, as well as students of color. And these students, especially now, they will need additional support from the federal government and others to re-engage those who have stopped out and help move them towards completion and into the workforce. And in the forthcoming stimulus packages, I would certainly encourage lawmakers to include funding for higher education in general and for micro grants in particular. Micro grants, as the name suggests, provide a small amount of cash assistance to students who have experienced a financial shock to cover emergency expenses like unanticipated medical bills. The amounts may appear small, but the impact, especially for the students when they are at a point of need, can be substantial. A micro grant can meet an immediate need, and that might otherwise cause a student to derail and get off track from completion. So that's why I really believe this is something we need to take very seriously. Micro grants are different from emergency loans in that they do not have to be repaid. And to reach the largest number of eligible students, we need to focus our funding on the institutions who most often serve them. Namely, that would be community colleges, historically Black colleges and universities, Hispanic serving institutions, tribal college, and many other minority serving institutions, as well as regional or non-selective public institutions. The current public health crisis is exposing existing inequities and gaps across the board. And suffice to say, we will need to rebuild our economy, and we're going to need to do so promptly, sustainably, and equitably. Higher education can play a role in helping to do this by ensuring that we have people who are ready for the workforce, and providing micro grants right now is an easy way to ensure that the financial shocks that students may encounter don't derail them and throw them off the path to completion. And it also can help bring back students who, as an incentive to students who have already left, and we want to bring them back and put them on that path. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you for that 5-minute succinct presentation. As a reminder, we'll be taking questions after our first 3 speakers, and you can submit your questions via the chat feature in the top right corner, and feel free to submit during the presentations. Up next, welcoming Iris Palmer, the Senior Advisor for Higher Education and the Workforce from New America. Iris, the next 5 minutes are yours.
Thank you so much. I am also really excited to be here this afternoon virtually. And my one big idea to help higher education weather this current crisis is to create a sustainable state-federal partnership. Michelle did a wonderful job outlining some of the really scary economic situations that are going on right now. I'll just add, it's incredibly unprecedented. States are going to be under enormous pressure to cut their higher education funding. We're also going to see delays in tax filings that are going to mean that the state budgets are under just extreme pressure that I don't think we've ever seen before. And we still aren't back up to the higher education funding that the states had before the last recession. And that means we're just in a really difficult situation. States like Missouri and Idaho are already making emergency cuts to higher education. I would not be surprised if other states follow suit. And we actually don't know what's going to happen with enrollments in the fall. In the medium term, we may very well see drops in enrollments as the uncertainty around the public health crisis directs students away from higher education paths that they thought were certain. And so that budget crunch could actually be an existential crisis for institutions that are already under such pressure, having to give refunds for the room and board that students had paid last semester. And obviously, this is also going to mean higher tuition, which we saw in the last recession. I think it's pretty clear that we need to have a massive federal investment in higher education and public higher education in particular, if we're going to be able to weather this crisis and come out with the stronger system that Michelle referenced. So during the last recession, through the State Stabilization Fund in the stimulus bill, we invested about $8 billion directly into higher education. Already in the CARES Act, we've done about $6 billion. And if you take out the emergency grant aid that was in that bill, but that's just nowhere near enough. But we did learn some lessons from the state stabilization stimulus in the last recession. So one of the requirements in that fund was that states had to maintain a certain level of funding for higher education, and that worked as far as it went. A lot of states cut right up to that limit all the years that those grants were available. And then when those grants were no longer available and that maintenance of effort provision, as it's called, was no longer in effect, states cut really deeply into their higher education funding. We can do better. and we should do better. And the way we can do better is by creating a grant program that is in perpetuity and goes forward, but also has adjustments for situations like this. And that would be this new state-federal partnership that could help smooth that state investment in higher education and also provide a vehicle for infusing, in this case, a massive amount of cash into the state higher education systems. So this program should be a direct block grant to states for their higher education systems, and it would require states to maintain a certain level of funding and then have a match for the states to increase their funding in higher education. But one thing that I think we should add to this, particularly given the really unprecedented pressure that's going to be on state budgets that we know and we can see coming in the future here, is to pick up a proposal first proposed by Darkus, which would waive the maintenance of effort requirements if unemployment rates rose above a certain level in states. Given that we've had just record-breaking unemployment filings for the last 3 weeks in a row, I think we can all be pretty sure that states would be reaching that threshold. And that would mean that states wouldn't have to maintain their investment in higher education and would still receive federal funds. And if they did maintain their investment in higher education, they would get additional federal funds that would be even more generous than those to the states that ended up cutting. Hopefully we reach better economic times, and once we do, I'd like to just do a shout out to BPC's idea that we then do a set aside in this program that would go into state rainy day funds for their higher education and help smooth that further. But thank you so much for listening, and I'm excited to hear the rest of the ideas on this conversation.
Iris, thank you for highlighting this really important policy approach. That should tie nicely with our next presenter. This is Andrew Gillen he's a senior policy analyst for the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Andrew, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Yeah, picking up where the previous commenters have left off, my sort of idea here is to just be as flexible as possible. And what I mean by that is we really don't know at this point if we're going to need to make really, really fundamental changes to the way education is been delivered for all of our lifetimes. And so, you know, if fast forward to fall, if things are back to normal, the students show up on campus and we just kind of go back to normal and things are great. But we don't know if even if things are normal, does this thing come back next year? Are there different variations of this flu that recurs? And so when I say be flexible, what I mean is let's try not to freeze kind of the existing educational patterns in place and use all of our resources doing that. Because if we do need to make changes, we'll be using all of our resources to basically kind of maintain the old rather than building the new infrastructure for the new educational normal, for lack of a better word. Okay, so how can you actually do that? So I think at the federal policy level, we're actually on pretty good footing because we already tend to fund students pretty directly. So Pell Grants, student loans, those go directly to students. And so as students kind of react to the new world, the funding will follow the students already. At the state level, that's not the case. So states do tend to fund institutions directly. And so I would actually encourage a lot of states to start mimicking the federal aid system and kind of funding students instead of institutions. The other thing that would be really helpful is to provide students with as much information as possible. So the two primary kind of information portals for students right now, the College Navigator and the College Scorecard, those are great, but the data is kind of a little dated on those. So if there's any way we could speed up the kind of population of the data on those platforms, that would be terrific. And then the third kind of component of this is that if there is a need for new institutions to emerge, accreditation is really going to be a barrier to that. And so we'll need to give some serious thought to what kind of changes we need to make to allow kind of new institutions of higher education to either fit into to the existing accreditation system, or to set up some sort of parallel system that operates outside of the existing accreditation system. And that is my big idea.
Thank you, Andrew. That gives us a lot to think about. And at this time, we're going to take some audience questions. Please note that some of the questions may be combined, or we may pose multiple questions in the interest of time. But it looks like for right now, I just have a singular question for each of our first presenters, and I'm going to kick things off with Michelle. So Michelle, the question that came in on the chat line, to really support stopout students across the spectrum, does higher ed first need to address lifelong learning across the spectrum?
Yes, I certainly think that supporting and encouraging lifelong learning would be a step in the right direction, because as we all know that there's always ways to, always things to learn. And as you think about careers and career advancements, there's always more information that can be gained to sort of increase the foundation upon which you're already standing. But in terms of right now, I think that the priority has to be helping to get people who we know are close to the finish line across that threshold and into the workforce. And as I mentioned in my comments, there are 36 million Americans. There are likely going to be even more when we do the calculations and counts for 2020 that fall into this category of people who are stopouts or some college of no degree, what we sometimes refer to them as. And with 36 million Americans being that close to the finish line and helping them to get a degree or credential that can help to support and boost and enhance our economy at a time when we desperately would need that as a country and for individuals, I think is certainly going to be a step in the right direction.
Thank you, Michelle. Next up, Iris. How do we ensure oversight or accountability, and how do we know students are actually going to see the money or impact from federal policies? Can Fed State also be a vehicle for oversight or accountability?
Well, that is a very complicated question, but a very good one and an important one. And I think in most of the proposals that have been put forward, there has been accountability, particularly affordability benchmarks and equity benchmarks that have been built into these systems. The requirements that come around the grant, as well as the way the grant is actually allocated to states, can both be used to further student outcomes from that particular grant. So a really good question, complex answer. I would definitely recommend doing further reading with some of the good proposals that are out there.
Thank you, Iris. And I have a final question for Andrew. Given the potential that there could be large or drastic changes to the accreditation system, how would we address issues of quality? Do you think there may be dangers that just allowing federal dollars to follow students might distort institutional behavior? So really, if there's large moves in accreditation, do you have one change in mind that would be helpful?
Yeah, so the way I sort of think about it is right now accreditation really has sort of a recipe approach where they sort of look at inputs and processes. And those are inputs and processes that have historically been associated with, acceptable educational quality. And so they sort of make everybody kind of mimic that. But that's not really necessary, right? Like to the extent that we can measure the outcomes we care about, we should not have any restrictions on inputs and processes. And so what are some outcomes that we actually care about? Well, it's student learning, labor market outcomes, and whatever else you want to throw in there. And so to the extent that we can measure student learning directly, we could use that. So for accounting programs, for example, a lot of them will take the Certified Public Accountant exam. Lawyers will take the bar exam. So we could actually use passage rates on those exams by school to allow providers to basically kind of provide an accounting education or a legal education just merely based on their passage rates on these exams. And you could do the same thing for earnings. So if a coding boot camp increases students' earnings by 10% or 20% or 30%, whatever, we can debate where the cutoff should be. That program should be eligible for financial aid. And so basically find outcomes that we care about and use those as almost escape hatches to accreditation.
Thank you, Andrew. I like that. Find metrics and outcomes that we care about. Those were some great questions. Thank you. Up next, it's time to get back to more big ideas. So I will not delay. Your next presenter joining us is Joanna Darkus, who's a staff attorney for the National Consumer Law Center. Joanna, I'm handing the baton off to you.
Good afternoon. As you heard, my name is Joanna Darkus. I'm an attorney at the National Consumer Law Center, where I'm a member of our Student Loan Borrower Assistance Project. My big idea is a simple step toward restoring the safety net for student loan borrowers. Our advocacy for borrowers in default is wide-ranging. The one step I will focus on here is to let student loan borrowers keep their income tax refunds. This is my refrain. Giving people cash helps them make ends meet. Giving people cash stimulates the economy. Before the COVID-19 outbreak, our low-income clients, most of whom are people of color, and others like them were already facing an epidemic of student debt and default. For them, educational debt already posed a distinct threat to their financial well-being and also for some to their physical health. Far too many of my clients struggled to repay their loans, even after their lives and careers did not pan out the way they bargained or expected, and even when that meant going without prescription medication or skipping meals. Let's talk about how the rest of the context in which the COVID-19 pandemic is unfolding might have an impact on similar borrowers. According to the National Employment Law Project, African Americans, Latinos, and women make up a disproportionate number of workers making below $15 an hour. News coverage and scholarly articles now proliferate to show that low-wage workers are not only the most likely to work jobs that increase their risk of contracting the virus, but reports of widespread layoffs and furloughs are concentrated in retail, food service, and accommodation jobs. For all these reasons, we must act quickly to alleviate known economic pressures on student loan borrowers, and particularly low-wage workers. Let's get to the Earned Income Tax Credit and why protecting the tax refund is important. For Americans who receive an income tax refund, that refund serves as an annual stimulus for their household balance sheet. It's the time of year when folks make big purchases or finally manage to save a little bit. By design, workers with modest earnings may qualify for an annual tax time bonus in the form of a refundable tax credit called the Earned Income Tax Credit, or EITC. And by design, workers who are caring for dependent children can receive the largest possible bonus payment of up to $6,557 for tax year 2019. That makes a big difference for families with annual earnings in the $20,000 to $30,000 range. This critical anti-poverty program has strong bipartisan support, yet each tax season, thousands upon thousands of student loan borrowers and their families are deprived of this vital cash infusion. The government's policy of seizing federal student loan borrowers' tax refunds that contain credits like the EITC runs counter to almost every goal Congress set for the program, as well as the goals of the federal student aid programs. When the federal government seizes these refund checks from student loan borrowers in distress, it traps low-income families in place, restricting economic mobility and making it harder for them to access safe, stable housing and to afford other basic necessities. Let's learn from the student loan crisis and from the current public health crisis. To help Americans make ends meet and to stimulate the economy, both the administration and the Hill have taken actions to put cash in the pockets of the people. The recovery rebate, or economic impact payments codified in the CARES Act, will be a direct cash infusion to many households. In addition to that direct release, the administration announced weeks earlier that it would give refunds of certain amounts that were involuntarily collected to repay defaulted student loans. Giving people cash helps them make ends meet. Giving people cash stimulates the economy. Even before the present public health crisis, lawmakers had proposed protections of the critical EITC and related tax credits like the child tax credit from seizure to repay defaulted student loans. Now is precisely the moment to move forward with such proposals and to make them permanent. A one-time fix in the midst of one public health crisis is no fix at all. This is one simple step, but it's a big idea because it will change the story of default for borrowers and their families. Frankly, I'm tired of hearing the heartbreaking stories of families whose tax refunds are seized. Now that we're in the throes of the COVID-19 pandemic, the need for widespread assistance is at the forefront. Let's push to ensure that borrowers who experience financial hardship that happens in the ordinary course, predictably or unexpectedly, will always find a safety net to catch them when they fall. Let's give the people cash, let them make ends meet, and let them prosper along with the economy. Thank you.
Joanna, thank you for highlighting the range of options to improve conditions for borrowers now and throughout the system. Next up, we have Tiffany Jones, currently the Senior Director of Higher Education Policy at the Education Trust. Tiffany, the mic is now yours.
Okay, great. So I'm going to talk about equity in student debt. And so COVID-19 may not discriminate, but the world that it's impacting certainly does. Black people, service workers, those with pre-existing condition are just examples of folks that are disproportionately impacted by the crisis. And so therefore, it helps us think about our proposals and how to solve this crisis. And any proposal to help people during this time should operate from the assumption that though the virus is widespread, its impact will be disproportionately felt because of kind of the pre-existing inequities in our society. And that includes inequity in higher education. So higher ed opportunity should be a substantial part of the COVID-19 response because college students are struggling and need urgent support. Creating opportunity even while public resources are stretched is necessary for the economy to be able to bounce back and for people to be a part of that recovery whenever it happens. And, you know, the previous recession is a great example regarding the importance of providing higher ed opportunity for folks to be able to participate in the economy, with nearly all of the new jobs created since that last recession requiring some sort of post-secondary degree or credential. The challenge is that part of the response to that last recession was another example where student borrowers were left out in terms of receiving any sort of loan forgiveness or and so again, as another part of how we got into this problem of student debt is because during that time as states made cuts, oftentimes colleges and universities responded by increasing tuition, and that meant students and families were borrowing more. And as a result, the outstanding debt more than doubled in the period between 2009 and 2019. And though some people are effectively managing their part of the now $1.7 trillion in outstanding student debt, 1 in 10 students default on their student loans. And that's far higher than the default rates of other types of consumer debt, many of which have better protections than student debt in particular. And so again, students of color, low-income students, those who start college but are unable to finish, those attending predatory colleges are some of the students who struggle the most to repay their loans. And again, this moment of crisis, there will be a lot of students who want to return to college in the fall who could benefit the most, but may be unable because of the persistent problem of students. So the challenge we're faced with is that equity advocates are clear that there's a problem with student debt, but they're torn about what to do about it. A lot of times, even progressives are split in their opinions around whether canceling any portion of student debt helps the students and communities that need the most support compared to other options. Some think equity means you prohibits canceling college debt for student loan borrowers who by definition are relatively well off at a time when resources are so limited, believing that college students include a privileged group. And this argument goes that, who needs the most should needs less should hold off while public officials invest more in the needs of those with the least. Others mean that equity means demanding forgiving all student debt for all college students because education shouldn't be financed through a debt-based system at all, where students are unable to pay or they fragile as a result, making them more vulnerable to crises like these. So both arguments have merit. Neither one is fully right. I guess the purpose of what I'd like to present here in terms of the big idea is an argument for an equity-driven student debt cancellation policy that would hopefully address some of the concerns from both perspectives. And so what that means is targeting debt forgiveness towards the students that need it the most. And so how do you determine who needs it the most? What are some of the factors that matter? First, income, but income not alone. It should be a determining factor for struggle. For example, high-income Black students, 1 in 3 will default on their student loans. That's 7 times the rate of their high-income white peers. That's just one example of why it's important to look at race in addition to income. Other factors that can help target debt forgiveness and to students with the highest need are wealth. It also might mean just raising the income caps that are put into a debt cancellation policy beyond traditional means testing. Again, because there's so many students who may not qualify for other types of public assistance, but struggle immensely with student debt. Another kind of issue that matters, even a small amount of forgiveness. I was at the end, but just to lay out kind of what we have in mind. There's a number of folks that have different proposals for how to target student debt cancellation. Senator Warren's proposed canceling up to $50,000 of student debt for students from families earning $100K and with some phasing out up until $250,000. Others, for example, Center for Responsible Lending has talked about forgiving $10,000 for all borrowers. And so what I'm just going to propose really quickly is another option for equity-focused targeting that could involve canceling up to $20,000 of student debt for anyone who from household earning less than $100,000 with some phasing out up until $200,000. And so how that phasing out could work is, again, providing $1 of student debt forgiveness for every $5 in income from in their total household earnings above $100,000. So that could mean that someone from a household earning $130,000 could get $14,000 in forgiveness. Also proposing that would be inclusive of private loans as well as all federal loans. And so just to close, many students will likely never pay off their student loans, and that group is only going to grow thanks to the current crisis. And so it's important to acknowledge that reality and perhaps, again, think about debt cancellation as an opportunity to let struggling borrowers prioritize their daily costs for the rest of their lives by canceling at least some portion of that debt. Also, why pushing that amount up into $20,000 is important, considering some of the disparate impact that we discussed. Average Black students borrowing over $30,000 for a bachelor degree suggests that amounts beyond $10,000 would be really important, especially for those particular groups. And then also just in closing, often the pushback is, why is it fair to give some debt cancellation to student borrowers? And it's just important, even in the response to this crisis, it should make it clear that what happens to one family impacts the other, and an importance of focusing on the collective impact of kind of economic crisis on the other. And so although even if a student is not a borrower themselves or someone in their household, understanding that the burden of student debt has a negative impact on the economy more broadly, and lastly, there will be trying times and limited resources. So it will just require, in some cases, reprioritizing. And just to put into context, in the last stimulus alone, corporations got 30 times the resources states and institutions were given to support higher ed. And so again, understanding that resources will not be unlimited, providing some sort of debt cancellation will require some reprioritization from policymakers. And so again, I'm not naive and understand that this will require incredible political and public will, but as higher ed is often the difference between a job with a livable wage and vital benefits like healthcare, it's worth the fight and deliberation now more than ever. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiffany. I'm still going to send one question live over to Joanna before we round out our final group of panelists. Joanna, as things become very economically uncertain, will ISAs become more attractive to students given their tie to income? And is that a good option for students looking to address financial need?
That's a big question, and my answer is simply that income share agreements pose distinct risks for consumers that are very hard to evaluate on the front end and also in the abstract. No two ISAs are equal, and it would be a shame if borrowers who are worried about traditional student loan products were looking for a quick fix and thought they might find that in an ISA. Unfortunately, it's just not that simple, and they might not be able to perceive the risks that those ISAs present to them. So hopefully borrowers, students won't feel the need to finance their education through debt in the future. As Tiffany just mentioned, we should look at rethink financing higher education through debt, period, be moving toward a debt-free future. But ISAs are not a simple solution or a quick fix, and borrowers could end up in trouble in other ways if they aren't careful in that market.
Thank you, Joanna, for weighing in on that question. Really, it's gone quickly, and we're on to our third and final round of speakers. Up next is Michael Rose, who's the Director of Government Relations for the National Association for College Admissions Counseling. Mike, you are now live and on the airwaves.
Great, thank you. Thanks for joining us today, as well as the invitation to participate. The trouble with going last is a lot of ideas have been at least touched on, if not talked about. But from our perspective, we definitely need to make sure there's a state and federal investment in higher education. When the economy took a dive in 2008, states had to do what they could to balance their budgets, and obviously higher education got a huge cut. And we never really saw that those cuts restored, and the federal government didn't really do a good job of doing a long-term plan to plug those holes. And so, and obviously that's going to be even worse this time around. So we really need to make sure that state and federal governments invest in higher education to make sure that the tuition stays down. I'd also like to see a move away from grants and towards loans. Obviously, these should be low income or low interest and generous to borrowers. But I think between reducing tuition because of the investment in higher education, as well as having low cost loans, it should make college more affordable for students. And because of the vast amounts of money going to higher education through this last stimulus bill, we want to really make sure that we protect students and taxpayers from unscrupulous colleges. Even over the last decade, actually several decades, unscrupulous colleges have always preyed on students that are not well informed or may not have realized what options they have to themselves. And they pick away billions of dollars from higher education and those students at a cost to taxpayers. So we really want to make sure that there's some sort of protections in place to make sure that students aren't going to the wrong institution and taxpayers are getting value for their dollar. I heard a quote the other day, I think it was from Speaker Pelosi, that where there is money, there is mischief. And I think that will describe the current environment moving forward, that a lot of people want to be getting their hands on these dollars, regardless of the cost to another student or the taxpayer. So unfortunately, right around the time where we need these protections in place, like gainful employment and borrower defense, they're being picked apart and eliminated by the Department of Education. So we really need Congress to step up and to implement some bipartisan solutions to make sure that students and taxpayers can have confidence moving forward. So I also think I just lost track of how much time I have left, but I'm happy to hand it over to the next speaker.
Thank you, Mike. We're going to continue to think a little more about strategic investment with our next panelist, who is Mark Schneider, the director of the Institute of Education Sciences. And Mark, you are on the air.
Sorry, I had to push the unmute button. So everybody has big ideas, and my idea is actually a rather small one, and it has to do with the concept of administrative bloat and what to do with about the size and the distribution of faculty and staff post-COVID, and when some semblance of normality may be restored. So the question is who to hire in what will likely be a tough environment as state and tuition revenues decline and as endowments are tumbling. So there's the question of what kind of investments in the staff and the personnel, which drive higher education, should schools be making as the world returns to normal. So this is the conventional wisdom, is that administrative bloat is driven by the proliferation of administrators. And schools get a lot of grief for administrative bloat, the proliferation of deans, assistant deans, associate deans, assistant associate deans, associate to assistant deans, and we could duplicate all that for provost. So, as you know, the National Center for Education Statistics is one of the constituent parts of IES, and IPEDS is the premier data supplier of information about post-secondary schools. And it's often used to document administrative bloat, but it turns out that it's actually a rather poor instrument for doing so. So, for example, in 2008, managers, which is the general category that includes deans, was 9% of FTE staff. And in 2018, guess what percent managers represented of total FTE staff? 9%. So we're not getting a lot of help from IPEDS with regard to administrative bloat. And here's the problem, and this is a mid-sized, smallish idea. All these data come from the HR, the Human Resource Survey, which is probably the most hated part of IPEDS. So expanding IPEDS to include the separate enumeration of deans and provosts and support staff in those positions, we see very little support from colleges and universities. There's also some question about how to define them. And since we don't have good definitions of deans and provosts, at least we say we don't, this has stopped IPEDS from counting these administrative positions. Yet I worked for a university, I've worked for several universities over a long course of an academic career, and every university that I've ever worked with seems to have found a way to create deans, associate deans, assistant deans. And actually, Wikipedia has a pretty good definition: the head of a college or university faculty or department. So that's a pretty good starting definition. And provost, in all the universities I know, provosts are chief academic officers. So is it possible to get IPEDS to get counts of deans, provosts, supporting staff? It is possible, but is it worth it? Right? These are small numbers of people. It is critically important to to what goes on in universities. I once calculated the average salaries of presidents, deans, provosts as a multiple of staff and staff salaries, faculty salaries, and the numbers are often scary. Here's another way to look at administrative bloat. In 2008, 33% of FTE and baccalaureate institutions were in instruction, research, and public service. Okay, in 2018, that was 31% were instruction and 36 were instruction, research, and public service FTE. In 2008, there was no enumeration of instruction at all. So again, we don't see a lot of evidence overall in administrative bloat and the percentage in instruction, research, and public service seems to be fairly constant. When we look at the percentage by institution, and I want to pick up, we also are in charge of the College Navigator, so it is possible to imagine reporting the percentage in instruction by institutions. That IPEDS has those data. We could actually do this already, but the problem there is setting all of this in the context. So if you compute the percentage in instruction, the highest percentage in instruction is in religious schools, especially yeshivas, and in for-profit colleges. The lowest percent is in big research universities because so much of their work is in professional and research functions. So we need a much more sophisticated view of instructional staff, the size of administrative, non-instructional staff, and the range of functions the university covers. So there really is no one size fits all to what an appropriate size faculty is, and the distribution of the faculty across different functions. It just matters to the university's functions, and to the university's mission. Finally, I want to raise an issue that I've been concerned about for some time. So we know that one of the outcomes of this, of what's going on in the shutting of universities and colleges, including actually K-12 also, is that we're moving more and more to online education. And one of the major questions that we need to know the answer to is, how well does online education work? And actually, more importantly, how well does it work for different categories and different classes of students? There's going to be wide variation in that. So ultimately, it's a major research task that we have to find out how online education is working and for whom. But I want to go back to the question of the administrative bloat and how we classify staff. So one of the most interesting things about online education is that the instructional task is being unbundled, as they say, and that is all of a sudden people like instructional designers, IT professionals are all needed to support online education and to develop and to maintain learning platforms. They are functionally essential to the delivery of instruction, but most schools don't classify them as instructional staff. So we don't even know what the instructional, the point of the sphere is, because it's no longer single faculty stepping into a classroom. It is a much larger enterprise with instructional designers and others supporting education and instruction. So we need to figure out how better to classify these kinds of support persons, and we then need to figure out exactly how online education is working and for whom. No big ideas here. We can get better information about what's going on the ground, and if we don't know what's going on the ground, how will we actually know where we're going? Thank you.
Mark, thank you for highlighting how hiring, HR, and classification impacts budgets and planning. Finally, we have our BPC fellow up next, and last, it's Robert Kelton. He's a fellow and associate professor of higher education at Seton Hall. He's also currently the chair of his department that he just took online. Robert, take us away.
Thanks. It's been an absolutely crazy stretch trying to get both my own 2 classes online and then working with the department. So I feel a little bit of the administrative, maybe not bloat side on my end, but it's been a challenge getting things to work. And also just being a faculty member, seeing how my college and other colleges have been trying to respond. And one big challenge that higher ed is facing right now is short-term liquidity, in that if they have a residential component, they're having to refund some room and board, they're losing revenue from on-campus enterprises, and they're colleges are deeply concerned about what will happen going forward for the next few months and potentially beyond, depending on the severity of this crisis. And one big idea is just helping colleges with liquidity. Even if it's just a revolving line of credit that's more available to colleges that have a hard time getting into the private credit market. And also, it hasn't happened yet, but I'm concerned about the private credit market starting to freeze up. That happened in 2008, and I'm concerned that if this goes forward much longer, that could happen again. And the other concern that's going to come out of this is what happens to colleges that can no longer stay open. Right now, if a college closes, there really aren't great plans in place to protect the students. Sometimes you have colleges that organize teach-out agreements with other institutions. Sometimes those are relatively thoughtfully done, but a lot of times they're put together at the last minute with institutions that may not be a great fit for students. And in even some cases, the colleges that are asked to do this really aren't that involved in the teach-out process. It's a little bit of a surprise to them when it comes. So much more needs to be done to frankly encourage every institution in the country to have a teach-out plan. It's not that they'll have to use it necessarily, but for example, Tulane University in New Orleans, it's a wealthy institution, but they had to close for Hurricane Katrina, and they had to figure out what to do with their students. And if every institution has to put together a reasonably thought out teach-out plan that another institution also agrees to, that removes some of the stigma and helps to protect students. And then thinking about what can be done to help encourage mergers and acquisitions. Anything that can be done for strong, healthy institutions to acquire ones on the verge of closure should be encouraged as well. I worry about the number of institutions that are likely to close over the next few months, and thinking about what can be done to both protect students and protect taxpayers so they're not on the hook. And with that, I'll yield back the balance of the time.
Thank you all, and thank you, Rob. We are just going to take a couple last questions to round out our hour. And Mark S., we had some folks ask questions about one, does administrative bloat also include wraparound services? Should we be concerned how these are being identified? And then, either or, if you'd like to take a stab at, what data do we currently have that could help measure how well online education works?
All right. So administrative bloat is just one of these, a term of art that's thrown around. So my question actually, which I would like answers from the audience, is the degree to which we can change the HR survey to get more particular information, for example, about the top line administrators and deans, associate deans, et cetera. So most of the discussion about administrative bloat tends to focus on the proliferation of deans and their support staff. So and again, the problem is that we could count these people that are in these positions. We can get numbers for the people in those institutions, but the question is the trade-off. So as I noted, HR is, we've been trying to slim down iPads forever, and it's a very difficult thing to slim down. And the HR survey is one of the ones that are, if we do, which we do, customer surveys, the HR component of iPads is the one that ranks the lowest in terms of the value. So we could get much more accurate information about components of the administrative staff. It would take years to, obviously years to figure out if they're increasing or decreasing in number. But the fact of the matter is it worth the effort? We care a lot about burden on institutions, and we just need to, and the question is it worth increasing the burden on institutions to get information about that? So with regard to online education, this is we don't know a lot, and the problem with not knowing a lot is that as we increase our reliance on online education, we're making something that we don't know a lot about even more important. So we know that some schools have spent a lot of time, a lot of money moving things online, and some of them, like Arizona State University and Southern New Hampshire, it's their bread and butter to do this. And actually, I must admit that those two institutions do an enormous amount of research on the effectiveness of the platforms and how well their platforms deliver education in terms of different kinds of things, like test results, in between online and on-ground education, graduation rates, and things like that. So we are beginning to get more information about online education. We know that online education is not for everyone. It has differential effects on success with different classes of students. Hispanic students tend not to do as well online education as other groups. So we need to figure out the distribution of effectiveness of online education. We need to identify the components of online education that works best and for whom. And again, a lot of this is being driven by the giant platforms like ASU, and IS is running competitions trying to increase the rigorous research about the effects of online education. And it's always the question, if we invest in online education, we have to know for whom it works.
Thank you, Mark. Popping back up, I do want to take time to throw one final question to Dr. Kelton. You mentioned having all institutions create a teach out plan. This is also something BPC's Task Force on Higher Education gave a shout out to, although we had questions about whether certain schools, if they met a threshold, should be allowed to essentially waive out or opt out. Can you tell us about if that's a good option, or if it's an advantageous reason to have every single institution fill out a plan?
Yeah, the reason why every institution should consider it is because natural disasters don't really respect endowments. And I get concerned about if there's a pandemic that's even more localized, that some institutions that are financially stable just even can't operate for a while. Or if there's a tornado or something, just to give students the opportunity to continue their education with as much continuity as possible, even though some of those institutions may end up opening again in some form.
Well, I can't believe I'm about to say this, but that brings our summit to a close. Thank you again for joining us today. Virtual standing ovation for our presenters who did the impossible task of conveying big ideas in 5 minutes. Please do not hesitate to reach out to New America, BPC, or any of our presenters with questions. We look forward to connecting with you all again soon as we collectively work to address the needs of faculty, staff, students, families, and institutions during this crisis and on the road to recovery. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Goodbye.